Hashtag Hitler ki Sabse Badi Galti. Ye decision WW2 Haar bana. June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 in the morning. Asterisk. The eastern horizon had not yet surrendered to dawn. Across a frontier stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers, from the Baltic shores in the north to the Black Sea marshlands in the south, 3 million German soldiers stood in absolute silence. Their breath formed small clouds in the cold pre-summer air. Tank engines idled. Artillery pieces pointed eastward like the fingers of some mechanical god. In that suspended moment before history tears itself apart, a Wehrmacht corporal named Klaus Steiner pressed his palm against the cold steel of his Panzer III and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him as a child. He could not have known, none of them could, that the decision made weeks earlier in a map room in East Prussia would become the turning point that would incinerate everything they believed in. The decision that would transform the greatest military machine ever assembled into a frozen, starving shadow of itself. The decision that would cost 27 million Soviet lives and guarantee Germany's total destruction. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the order came. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began not with a declaration of war, not with diplomacy's final collapse, but with the thunder of thousands of guns firing simultaneously across the endless frontier. The largest military operation in human history had begun, and with it, Adolf Hitler's greatest mistake. To understand why this moment mattered, why this single decision would doom the Third Reich more certainly than any bomb, any battle, any enemy strategy, one must return to the spring of 1941, to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler had already conquered a continent. By May of that year, Nazi Germany stood astride Europe like a colossus. Poland had fallen in 27 days, Denmark in 6 hours, Norway in 2 months, Holland in 5 days, Belgium in 18. France, the great France of Napoleon and Verdun, the France that had bled Germany white in the previous war, had surrendered in just 6 weeks. British forces had been hurled into the sea at Dunkirk. Yugoslavia had collapsed in 11 days. Greece in 3 weeks. Crete had fallen from the sky itself, taken by German paratroopers in a display of military virtuosity that shocked the world. The Wehrmacht appeared invincible. Its blitzkrieg doctrine, lightning war, had rewritten the rules of modern combat. Fast-moving tank columns supported by tactical aircraft, cutting through enemy lines like a surgeon's scalpel, encircling armies, creating pockets of surrender. It was warfare as art form, as science, as inevitability. German generals studied their maps with the confidence of men who had cracked some eternal code. Hitler himself walked through the gardens of the Berghof, his mountain retreat, and saw before him a Europe remade in his image. Swastika flags flew from Paris to Athens, from Oslo to the Pyrenees. Only Britain remained defiant across the Channel, bruised and alone. The Führer's architect, Albert Speer, was already drawing plans for Germania, the massive reconstruction of Berlin that would transform it into the capital of a 1,000-year Reich. Granite monuments, triumphal arches, buildings so vast they would dwarf the pyramids. But Hitler's eyes were not on Britain. They were turned eastward. On the other side of that vast frontier lay the Soviet Union, the ideological enemy, the Slavic subhumans that Nazi racial doctrine deemed inferior, the communist state that represented everything the Third Reich opposed. And more than ideology, more than race theory or territorial ambition, there lay something else. Space. Lebensraum. Living space. The endless grain fields of Ukraine. The oil fields of the Caucasus. The minerals and timber and resources of a continent-sized nation. Hitler had always intended to invade the Soviet Union. He had written as much in Mein Kampf 2 decades earlier. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 was never meant to last. It was a convenience, a way to secure Germany's eastern flank while dealing with Poland and the West. Now, with Western Europe subdued, Hitler believed the time had come to fulfill his ultimate vision. His generals were not so certain. In the war rooms of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command, Men who had studied warfare their entire lives looked at maps of the Soviet Union and felt something they had not experienced in 2 years of unbroken victory: doubt. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, understood numbers. The Soviet Union was not Poland or France. It covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. From its western border to the Ural Mountains was over 2,000 kilometers, farther than the distance from Berlin to Madrid. Its population exceeded 190 million people. Its army, even after Stalin's devastating purges of the late 1930s, numbered in the millions. Its industrial capacity, particularly in tank and aircraft production, was vast. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who would command Army Group South, studied weather reports from previous decades. Russian winters, he noted in his diary, were not like German winters. Temperatures could plunge to -40 degrees Celsius. Roads, and Russia had far fewer paved roads than Western Europe, would become rivers of mud in autumn and spring, frozen concrete in winter. Supply lines stretching thousands of kilometers would become nightmares of logistics. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of panzer warfare, worried about mechanical endurance. German tanks were precision instruments, engineered for European roads and distances. What would happen when they had to drive not hundreds but thousands of kilometers across terrain that barely had roads? But their concerns fell on deaf ears. Hitler had convinced himself of something that no amount of evidence could dislodge: that the Soviet Union was a house of cards, ready to collapse at the first blow. He believed Stalin's purges had decapitated the Red Army's leadership. He believed Soviet soldiers, ideologically contaminated by Bolshevism, racially inferior by Nazi standards, would surrender en masse when faced with the superior German soldier. He believed, in his core, that the campaign would be over in 12 weeks. "We have only to kick in the door," Hitler told his assembled generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." It was this belief, this absolute conviction that victory would come quickly and easily, that made Operation Barbarossa not just a military campaign, but a civilizational gamble. Hitler was betting everything: the future of Germany, the lives of millions, the fate of Europe itself, on his intuition that the Soviet Union would shatter like glass. He was wrong. The German soldiers who crossed the border that June morning expected a repeat of France. They had been told the campaign would be brief, over before winter. They packed light uniforms, summer rations. Some wrote letters home saying they would be in Moscow by August, back in Germany by Christmas. Klaus Steiner, the corporal with the Panzer III, had a photograph of his fiancée tucked inside his helmet. He planned to propose properly when he returned, with a ring bought from saved pay. The opening weeks seemed to confirm Hitler's prediction. Soviet forces, caught completely by surprise despite numerous intelligence warnings Stalin had ignored, reeled backward. German panzer columns raced across the landscape at speeds that shocked even their own commanders. Entire Soviet armies found themselves encircled, cut off, forced to surrender. At Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers became prisoners. By September, Army Group Center stood less than 300 kilometers from Moscow. The numbers were staggering. In the first 3 months, the Wehrmacht captured over 2 million Soviet soldiers, destroyed or captured 18,000 tanks and 14,000 aircraft. The victories were so overwhelming that Hitler, in a speech to the German people in October, declared that the Soviet Union was broken and would never rise again. But beneath the surface of these victories, something else was happening, something the German commanders slowly, then with growing horror, began to recognize. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. It was retreating, yes. Losing armies, yes. But not breaking. Soviet factories, entire industrial complexes, were being dismantled and moved eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach. Over 1,500 enterprises, aircraft plants, tank foundries, munitions factories, were transported by rail deep into Siberia and Central Asia, where they continued producing weapons. Soviet workers, including women and teenagers, labored 18-hour shifts in unheated factories to keep production going. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, kept fighting. Units that by all logic should have surrendered fought to annihilation instead. New divisions appeared to replace destroyed ones. The house of cards was not falling. It was absorbing blows that would have destroyed any other nation, and somehow continuing to resist. And then the weather changed. October 7th, 1941. Klaus Steiner stood beside his panzer and stared at the sky. For 3 days, rain had fallen without pause. The dirt roads, the Russian roads that were barely roads at all, just paths worn through the steppe, had transformed into channels of thick, bottomless mud. The Germans had a word for it: Rasputitsa, the season of mud. His tank, which had rolled across France at 40 kilometers per hour, now struggled to move 4. Sometimes it couldn't move at all. Tracks spun uselessly. Engines screamed and overheated trying to pull free. Across the entire front, hundreds of thousands of German vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery tractors, supply wagons, became trapped. Fuel convoys that should have taken days took weeks. Ammunition ran short. Food ran shorter. The advance, which had seemed unstoppable, ground to a halt. Steiner had expected many things from this campaign. He had expected Soviet resistance, weak resistance but resistance. He had expected summer heat. He had expected long marches. What he had not expected was this: to be defeated not by enemy soldiers, but by earth itself, by simple mud that swallowed machinery and progress and hope. And then, in November, the mud froze. At first, the German soldiers welcomed it. Frozen ground meant movement again. The advance toward Moscow resumed. Army Group Center, reinforced and reorganized, pushed forward through the forests west of the capital. In some places, reconnaissance units got close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. But with the frozen ground came something else: cold. Not German cold. Not the cold of a Berlin winter where temperatures might drop to -10 and you could still function with a proper coat and gloves. This was Siberian cold. Arctic cold. Cold that turned metal brittle and shattered it. Cold that froze engine oil into sludge, making vehicles impossible to start. Cold that made weapons jam. Cold that turned human flesh white and dead in minutes of exposure. German soldiers, issued summer uniforms and light jackets because the campaign was supposed to be over by now, began to freeze. First came frostbite, toes and fingers turning black, needing amputation. Then came death. Sentries froze at their posts. Wounded men died not from their injuries, but from exposure. Soldiers slept pressed together in bunkers and dugouts, burning furniture and books and anything combustible to stay alive. In December, temperatures near Moscow dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Klaus Steiner wrote in a letter home, one of the last letters that would make it through before his unit was encircled: "We were told we would be home for Christmas. Now I pray only to see spring." The cold was not just weather. It was revelation. German soldiers, who had been raised on propaganda about their racial superiority, their inevitable victory, the weakness of Slavic peoples, now found themselves facing an enemy that seemed immune to conditions that were killing Germans by the thousands. Soviet soldiers wore quilted jackets, felt boots, fur hats with ear flaps. Their weapons, the PPSH submachine gun, the T-34 tank, the Katyusha rocket launcher, were designed for Russian conditions. Simpler, cruder, but functional and cold that made German precision engineering useless. The T-34's wide tracks distributed weight better in mud and snow. Its diesel engine started in temperatures that left German gasoline engines frozen solid. More than equipment, there was something else, something that shook the ideological foundation of every German who witnessed it. Soviet soldiers fought with a ferocity, a determination, a willingness to die that contradicted everything they had been told about subhuman Slavs. At Brest Fortress, on the very first day of the invasion, a garrison of Soviet border guards held out for weeks against overwhelming German force. When the fortress finally fell, the Germans found messages scratched into walls: "I am dying, but I do not surrender." Outside Moscow, Siberian divisions transferred from the east, men hardened by cold, trained in winter warfare, launched counterattacks that drove German forces back for the first time since the war began. Panicked radio messages spoke of Soviet soldiers attacking through snow, appearing like ghosts, fighting hand-to-hand with knives and entrenching tools when ammunition ran out. The myth of easy victory, of racial superiority, of inevitable German triumph, began to crack. But ideology dies hard, especially when reinforced by power. Hitler, receiving reports of the stalled offensive, the retreating armies, the mounting casualties, did what authoritarians through history have done when reality contradicts their worldview. He denied reality. He fired generals who spoke of retreat. He issued orders forbidding withdrawal even from untenable positions. He declared that German soldiers must hold every meter of captured ground regardless of cost. When Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, suggested pulling back to defensible winter lines, Hitler removed him and took personal command of the army himself. This was the second mistake, compounding the first. A leader with no formal military training, operating from a headquarters hundreds of kilometers from the front, making tactical decisions that professional soldiers knew were suicidal. German units, ordered to hold impossible positions, were encircled and destroyed. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the pocket at Demayansk, dozens of smaller disasters. Each time, Hitler's response was the same: no retreat. Fight to the last man. Victory or death. The German war machine, which had conquered a continent through mobility and flexibility, became rigid, static, predictable. Everything blitzkrieg was not. And still the Soviet Union did not collapse. Winter, 1942. Klaus Steiner no longer believed they would win. That faith had frozen to death somewhere between Smolensk and Moscow. Now, pressed into a snow trench with 3 other men from his tank crew, burning pieces of wooden crates to keep from freezing, he thought about the one thing that haunted every German soldier on the Eastern Front: food. Soviet prisoners, interrogated by German intelligence, described rations that seemed impossible. Black bread, cabbage soup, salted fish, kasha, buckwheat porridge. Simple food, but enough of it. Enough to keep soldiers fighting, marching, surviving. German rations, by contrast, had become a fantasy. Supply lines stretched across 1,000 kilometers of partisan-infested territory could not deliver enough. Horses. The Wehrmacht had brought 750,000 horses into the Soviet Union for transport, died by the hundreds of thousands, frozen or starved. Without horses, supply wagons couldn't move. Without supplies, soldiers starved. Steiner's daily ration, when it came at all, was a piece of bread, a thin soup, occasionally a bit of horse meat from animals that had collapsed. He had lost 15 kilograms. His uniform hung on him. His gums bled. His hair fell out. These were symptoms of starvation, though the word itself was never used in official reports. In his delirium, he thought often of the propaganda he had seen before the war. Images of German plenty, strong soldiers, abundant meals, the superiority of the German system. Where was that abundance now? Where was that strength? He thought, too, of something he had seen weeks earlier and tried to forget. A German unit had captured a Soviet supply depot. Inside were crates of canned food. Thousands of crates. Meat, vegetables, condensed milk. More food than his entire division had seen in a month. The Soviet system, the system they'd been told was weak, chaotic, inferior, had managed to supply its armies in the middle of winter in the middle of Russia better than the mighty Wehrmacht could supply itself. That single image, German soldiers, starving, staring at Soviet abundance, became for Steiner a symbol of something larger, something he did not yet have words for, the possibility that everything they had been told was a lie. By 1943, the Eastern Front had become a meat grinder consuming German strength. At Stalingrad, the Sixth Army, an entire field army of 300,000 men, was encircled and destroyed. Hitler had ordered them to hold the city at all costs. They held it unto annihilation. When the remnants finally surrendered in February 1943, only 91,000 emaciated men stumbled into Soviet captivity. Of those, Only 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. At Kursk, in July 1943, Hitler launched the largest tank battle in history, hoping to regain the initiative. Nearly 3 million men, 8,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft collided in a battle that raged for weeks. The Germans lost decisively. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. From that point forward, it was retreat, slow, bloody, but inevitable. The Soviet Union, which Hitler had believed would collapse in 12 weeks, was not only surviving but growing stronger. Its factories, now safely beyond German reach, were producing 29,000 tanks in 1943 alone, more than Germany would produce in the entire war. Soviet artillery, aircraft, and ammunition poured from assembly lines in quantities that dwarfed German production. American Lend-Lease aid, trucks, food, raw materials, helped sustain the Soviet war effort. The tide had turned completely. German soldiers, who had marched east singing songs of victory, now retreated west fighting desperate rearguard actions. Klaus Steiner, if he survived, records do not say, would have been among them, watching the endless columns of refugees, the burned villages, the frozen corpses lining the roads. He would have seen the Tiger tanks and Panther tanks, technological marvels that arrived too late and in too few numbers. He would have seen the Luftwaffe disappear from the skies, overwhelmed by Soviet numbers. Most of all, he would have understood the truth that Germany's leaders refused to accept, that the decision to invade the Soviet Union, made with such confidence in June 1941, had doomed the Third Reich more certainly than any other single factor.
Why?
Why did this one decision, this one gamble, prove fatal? Not because the Wehrmacht was weak. It was perhaps the finest military force in the world in 1941. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill. They demonstrated both in horrifying abundance. The decision was fatal because it violated the most fundamental principle of warfare: never fight a war you cannot sustain. Germany's economy, for all its industrial might, could not support a prolonged multi-front war. German oil production was insufficient. The Wehrmacht ran on captured fuel and imports from Romania. Never enough. German manpower was limited. A nation of 80 million could not replace casualties at the rate the Eastern Front consumed them. German logistics were stretched beyond breaking, supply lines thousands of kilometers long across destroyed infrastructure. The Soviet Union, by contrast, could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other nation. Its population of 190 million provided seemingly endless reserves. Its industrial capacity, once relocated beyond German reach, was untouchable. Its territory was so vast that even massive German advances barely dented it. Its winter was an ally no amount of German planning could defeat. Hitler had bet that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, making these disparities irrelevant. When it did not, when the house of cards proved to be built of steel and ice and blood, Germany was locked into a war of attrition it could not win. Every German soldier killed on the Eastern Front was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed, every aircraft shot down, every ton of fuel consumed, weakened Germany permanently. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, grew stronger. Its armies larger, its tactics better, its equipment more numerous. The mathematics of destruction were inexorable. By 1944, Soviet forces were pushing into Poland. By early 1945, they stood on German soil. The nation that had conquered a continent now saw its own cities burned, its people fleeing, its army shattered. Berlin, which Hitler had dreamed would become Germania, capital of a 1,000-year Reich, became a battleground where Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag. Hitler himself, in a bunker beneath the ruins, took his own life on April 30th, 1945. He left behind a testament blaming everyone, the generals, the German people, fate itself, for the defeat. But he never acknowledged the truth, that the decision to invade the Soviet Union was his alone, and it had killed everything he built. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the counterfactuals endlessly. What if Germany had not invaded the Soviet Union? What if Hitler had focused on defeating Britain first? What if Operation Barbarossa had been launched in April instead of late June, giving the Wehrmacht 2 more months before winter? But these questions, however fascinating, miss the deeper point. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not merely a tactical error or poor timing. It was the inevitable expression of Nazi ideology itself. Hitler did not invade Russia despite his beliefs. He invaded because of them. The conviction that Slavic peoples were inferior, the obsession with Lebensraum, the apocalyptic vision of a race war between Germanic civilization and Bolshevik Jewish conspiracies. These were not peripheral ideas that could be discarded. They were the core of Nazism. Which means the mistake was not the decision to invade. The mistake was the ideology that made the invasion inevitable. An ideology based on racial mythology, on contempt for other peoples, on the belief that will and violence could overcome reality itself. That ideology met reality on the frozen steppes of Russia and shattered against it. Epilogue. There is a museum in Moscow, the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War, where among the countless exhibits documenting the Soviet Union's catastrophic sacrifice, there sits a single item that captures everything: a German mess tin. It is dented, rusted, unremarkable. Found in the snow outside Stalingrad, it still bears the faint imprint of its owner's identification number. Inside, when it was discovered, were the remains of a meal, a few spoonfuls of watery soup, frozen solid. A German soldier's last meal, unfinished, preserved by the same cold that killed him. That mess tin, empty, frozen, abandoned, stands as symbol of the larger truth. Not a truth about German wickedness or Soviet virtue, though both existed in abundance, but a simpler truth, older than ideology, that no amount of propaganda can make a starving army strong. No racial theory can generate fuel for tanks. No force of will can make summer uniforms warm in a Russian winter. Reality is patient. It does not argue with ideology. It simply waits, indifferent, for belief to collide with fact. And when that collision comes, when 3 million men march into the vastness of Russia expecting easy victory and instead find mud and ice and an enemy that refuses to break, reality wins. Always. Hitler's greatest mistake was not a tactical decision on a map. It was the fundamental delusion that his will, his vision, his ideology could bend reality to match his dreams. That superiority existed because he declared it. That victory was inevitable because he believed it. The Eastern Front, that vast grave stretching from Stalingrad to Berlin, where 27 million Soviet citizens and 4 million German soldiers died, is the monument to that delusion. Klaus Steiner's mess tin, if it was ever found, probably sits rusted in some forgotten field. But that German mess tin in Moscow, empty and cold, tells a story, and the story of millions like him. Men who believed what they were told, who marched east singing, who died in the snow wondering how the invincible became the destroyed. The answer was always there, waiting in the frozen earth. Ideology cannot defeat geography. Will cannot overcome logistics. And a house of cards, when it turns out to be built of Russian winter and Soviet determination and simple human refusal to surrender, will not fall no matter how hard you kick the door. That was Hitler's greatest mistake. Not the decision itself, but the illusion that made the decision seem wise. And that illusion, like the Third Reich it spawned, lies buried in the snow.